My talk is titled High Fidelity, but it also bears an epigram, which is actually from Cole Porter's Kiss Me Kate. It's a line somebody sings, and the line goes, I'm always true to you, darling, in my fashion, always true to you, darling, in my way. Now, any essay about translating poetry must consider the question of fidelity, or to be more precise, the degrees of fidelity, the object of fidelity, and the way fidelity might go about establishing itself. As a poet who after 3 of his own books became a translator of poetry, and later of fiction too, I'm constantly coming up against these questions. But how did I get here? I should briefly begin with the circumstances. Our family left Hungary following the failed uprising of 1956. I was just 8. From that time on, I spoke English only and began publishing books of poetry in English some 23 years after leaving. My residual knowledge of Hungarian was that of a reasonably clever child, but then, in 1984, I returned to Hungary for the first time as a poet on an Arts Council grant and was immediately approached to translate Hungarian poems. This was to be with the help from scholars and other poets until I recovered enough of my Hungarian to do the work myself. A word more about my starting position. I did not study English at A-level or at university, but went to art school. I had dropped English literature at O-level. My school reading of poetry began independently in the mid to late 60s. It was utterly indiscriminate, taking in all periods, all styles, in any order, without any secondary literature. This miscellaneous mass of material included translations cheaply available in Penguin and other editions, some of which had the original text underneath, with a prose crib in the form of prose, others being directly translations without the original text. So that was how I read Yevtushenko, Rimbaud, Rilke, Baudelaire, Cavafy, and very many others. A little later, but before the return to Hungary, I also got to read some Hungarian poets in English translation. Ted Hughes's versions of Belinsky, Edwin Morgan's Sándor Vörös, as well as some of his Attila József, and David Weevil's Ferenc Juhász, among others. Pretty soon, I became aware that Ted Hughes's translations of Belinsky were not quite Belinsky, but that, like Robert Lowell's imitations, if not to the same extent or in the same way, they made a potent text. Still later, it became obvious, particularly in reading Tara Bergen's research on Hughes's Belinsky translations, that Hughes, who couldn't read Hungarian at all, was working directly from literal translations prepared by a Hungarian poet, János Csokics, and ignoring not only the essentially classicist aspect of Belinsky's formalism, but also Csokic's contextual notes, the kind I received from Hungarian scholars. In other words, Hughes was less concerned about fidelity to some original, but having seen and heard a raw potential in the material of the poems, in Csokic's version, in other words, his raw version, he seized on something on it. That which he seized on had effectively become Belinsky for English language readers. Belinsky, I imagine, was probably aware of this, but didn't object. He was glad to be alive in English in some form, especially translated by a poet as famous as Hughes. I felt less at liberty to ignore the notes prepared for me by scholars. And in any case, the Hungarian practice of translating poetry was quite different to what I found in the Penguin series. Much the most of it was what they called formahű, meaning formally faithful to the original. Rhymed sonnets remained rhymed sonnets, iambic pentameters remained iambic pentameters, even Szirtes and onomatopoeia were supposed to remain in more or less the place they occupied in the original. There were three main reasons why this was possible. Hungarian translators were not primarily translators with clearly developed ideas on translation, but outstanding poets in their own right, fully capable of turning elegant formal verse when they chose. Secondly, because Hungarian poetry allows for either stress or duration in its metrics, it is remarkably flexible. There is very little that is unnatural to it. Furthermore, because Hungarian is unrelated to any other European language, except distantly to Finnish and Estonian, it has always relied on translation in order to establish a working relationship with major European currents. In other words, the quality of translation was high, and there was a great deal of it, far more than in England. Shakespeare, of course, was constantly translated and retranslated by leading poets, and still is. Now, I don't want this talk to be restricted entirely to translating out of Hungarian, but there are some interesting practices embedded in it. I want to explore it a little further before moving to more general ideas. Introducing a Hungarian poem to another language tends to feel like a serious responsibility. As the editor of my translation of 19th century poet Imre Madács's verse play, The Tragedy of Man, put it to me, these lines are proverbial for us. People know many of them by heart, having learned them at school. In other words, the lines I was translating had to convey the sense of being familiar to the point of being proverbial in English, the receiving language. But what, in such a case, is a translator to be faithful to? Well, the poet, translator of poetry, has to start somewhere and has to make certain decisions pretty early, because, unlike a reader, he or she is going to be constructing something in the receiving language, knowing from their own practice that the process of constructing poems is certain to modify the process of evolving meaning, that interpretation begins on the same stage as presenting, and that fidelity is a kind of unfolding. I may, in all generosity, suppose that both Oliver Bernard and I are faithful to something unfolding, both in Rambo and in our own work, and that in some respects we may, indeed must, overlap, and that where we overlap may be the territory where we might reasonably find Rambo, that we, while operating under different constraints, are in effect triangulating on a point where the real Rambo, if there is such a thing, is hiding. Let me take a short Hungarian poem as example, one translated by other poets too. It is by one of the great Hungarian and, for my money, great European poets of the second half of the 20th century, Ágnes Nemesnagy, who was born in 1922 and died in 1991. Nemesnagy's prose poems are distinctly modernist in manner, but she was also a strict formalist to the extent that she could cut friendships on the basis of a disagreement about form. This is one of her very short poems composed in the late 1960s. This is the Hungarian text. Now what I'd like you to do is I'd like to have her read the poem for us.
Szobrokat vittem. Szobrokat vittem a hajón, hatalmas arcuk névtelen. Szobrokat vittem a hajón, hogy álljanak a szigeten. Az orr és a fülporca között 90 fokos volt a szög, különben rajtuk semmi jel. Szobrokat vittem a hajón, és így sülyedtem el.
Now, the poem tells us that the first person singular, I, was carrying certain statues on board a ship. The statues were in fact busts, enormous heads of anonymous people. And the ship was supposed to carry them to an island where the statues were to stand. All she tells us about the statues is that there were precisely 90 degrees between the nose and the ear in each case. But presumably because they are too heavy, the ship sinks. We are not told of the significance of the statues and why they had to be transported to an island. We may or may not assume that the speaker is drowned. That is the material of the poem in isolation, but it may help to know something of the context. We may, for example, discover that Nemesnaj had written a longer poem titled simply Statues, which in the collected poems is placed directly next to this shorter one. In that one, the poet partly identifies herself with a statue and talks about turning herself into stone. Why might that be? In 1948, following the war, but before the Stalinist assumption of power, Nemesnaj had, along with others, just established a new literary magazine, Uyhold, meaning New Moon. She was just 26 at the time, and on the threshold of a major literary career. But the political system was about to change, and within less than a year of its founding, the magazine was banned, and a number of people associated with it, including her husband, a prominent literary critic, were thrown into jail by the new Stalinist authorities. Nemesnaj's career was put on hold for several years. The poems she wrote, but which remained unpublished at the time, were often about the need for spiritual and artistic survival under duress. Stones survive and trees survive. She wrote about both. We may be aware that other poets at this time, the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert among them, resorted to the image of stones or pebbles under similar circumstances. One must, in effect, become as stone. But stones are heavy. Becoming stone weighs on the soul. Our awareness of Nemesnaj's approach to formality might also help us to note that one of the lines in the poem occurs 3 times, and that its lines have 3 beats in essentially dactylic bum-ba-bum pattern, except for the last line, which is an iambic finality that echoes the sinking of something heavy. But there's also something of nursery rhyme about the poem, as well as of call and response. It is like a fragment of something bigger but undefined, somewhat like the statues themselves, whose proportions, however, and I mean those 90 degrees between the nose and ear, are just as precise as the rhythm of the verse. The language is very simple, the effect proverbial. The repeated line is a reminder of something grave and unavoidable. It is a sign of the sinking to come. The only translation of the poem of which I was aware at the time was by the Irish poet and scholar Hugh Maxwell in his translation of Nemesnaj's selected poems, Between. This is how his translation goes. I carried statues. On board ship carried statues, huge faces unrecognized. On board ship carried statues to stand on the island. Between nose and ears, perfect right angles, otherwise blank. On board ship carried statues, and so I sank. My own feeling was that Maxton wanted to convey the mystery of the poem by offering a degree of alienation, chiefly by omitting the pronoun I and inverting the natural word order in the second line, opting for faces unrecognized rather than unrecognized faces. He abandoned the rhyme scheme, but for the blank sank rhyme at the end. I missed the rhythmic structure and full rhymes of the original. In fact, while admiring Maxton's approach to many of the poems that worked in a less formal way, there was, I felt, a missing epigrammatic yet monumental side to Nemeshnaj's poetry that was of key importance. The difficulty of Nemeshnaj's poems was not in the syntax, vocabulary, diction, or verse, but in the realm of experience and vision out of which they arose. The difficulty lay in the symbolic, which remained at depth. It was for that reason I set out on my volume of selected poems by Nemeshnaj, The Night of Akhenaton. Statues, Sobrok. Statues I carried on board, vast faces, unnamed and unspanned. Statues I carried on board to the island where they should stand. Between nose and ear there were 90 degrees, measured precisely, with no other sign of their sank. Statues I carried on board, and so I sank. I would be foolish to claim that my version was better than Maxton's, though at one level, of course, I think it is a must-do, otherwise I wouldn't do it. But in any case, in what way might it be better? Better as a translation? Better as a poem? It's difficult to know. As I've said, the translator of Hungarian poetry bears a heavy responsibility because so few Hungarian poets are translated, and because one owes it to the poet to seek the truth of the poem in the original, not in the process of translation, not at least if it leads to a quite different poem. But what if one is translating a well-known poem that has often been translated? There isn't a simple answer to that because fidelity will depend on context. Why is a translation being done? For whom? With what purpose? The poet, like the character in Kiss Me Kate who declares she is always true to her regular partner in her fashion, is looking for a degree of fidelity. But fidelity to what end and in whose fashion? I want now to think of some different variations on fidelity, with the heavy responsibility cast off. These are my own variations translating from languages I don't personally speak. In this case, it'll both times be from Russian. And all of these were commissions of one or other sort, not to be the first conveyor of the poems into English, but to do something interesting with them. I'll start with the great Russian poet, Anna Ahmadva. The original commission was to produce 4 or 5 translations for an evening. That was to produce an anthology. I needed help, of course, and I considered the commission as a matter of responsibility in exactly the same way as I did with my Hungarians. And the translations produced are close to the originals in as many ways as I could gracefully manage. But reading through Richard McCain's very big collected poems of Anna Ahmadva, I came across a 2-line poem. It seemed to me like a rather ambiguous epigram in which Ahmadva refers to abuse as praise. I wanted to explore it. My exploration consists of 16 couplets grouped into 4 movements, all based on the same 2 lines. I won't read them all, but here is a flavor. So here's a basic theme. This is what McCain writes out of Ahmadva. For me, praise from others is like ash. From you, even abuse is praise. So it's in 4 movements. I just read you the first. Each of these is a variation on the original couplet. I can dismiss the praise of all the rest, but when you censure me, I still feel blessed. The praise I get from others is mere guff. For me, your slightest cavil's praise enough. I don't take compliments from anyone. Your mere abuse is worth a smug well done. When others praise my poems, it makes me spit. I just adore it when you say they're shit. I realize, of course, that is a game that turns to comedy. But the game itself is fascinating and not entirely frivolous, in that each variation articulates a possible aspect of the original poem. What it lacks, of course, is gravity. The implied relationship of the poet to the addressee may imply a more severe kind of passion. The game is not frivolous, but has been undertaken without responsibility. If by responsibility we mean the obligation one might feel in translating a Hungarian poem for the first time. But one may play more seriously. After Ahmadva, I was asked by a Russian scholar and translator Veronika Krasnova to translate with her help just 4 lines of Osip Mandelstam. The poem, titled Voronezh, was a reflection on the poet's internal exile by Stalin in the city of Voronezh. It was, she said, packed with puns and rhymes and other wordplay, in fact impossible. She read the poem to me, she gave me a glossary and a pronunciation guide. I understood that the name Voronezh referred to both a raven, Voron, and a knife, Noj. The result was the same poem, translated 7 times. Here we are. The Voronezh variations, after Osip Mandelstam. Raven, Voron, Noj, blade, winds me out, rewinds me. The blade must fall, the raven's free, it binds me, returns, revenues, misses me and finds me. Voronezh, raven's blade, whose whim defines me. Voron, a raven, Noj, a snitch, ditched by Voronezh, like unstitched leaves, reached by Voronezh, rehitched, stitched, up by the bitch Voronezh, the raven with the snitch. Raven's ditch, raven's brook, raven's beak, let me go, let me come, or else you will seek me in vain, Voronezh, having dropped my life on a whim, raven whose beak is sharp as a knife. Alternatively, crow, the crow's bright blade. Will you crow now, Voronezh? No, I have gone. Will you drop me or gather me in your masquerade? Crow, joker with your sharp beak of black crow shade. Thieving magpie, Voronezh, black and sharp as night. Will you drop your lute or pick it up and punish your son with it, as a raven or a magpie might, you who are only a joke yourself, Voronezh? This is no joke, Voronezh. I am not Poe's raven. I will not come knocking for you to drop the latch and lock me out. I have no knife to prize my way in, but I will return, Voronezh, sharp as a raven's snitch. Let me go. Return me to my lost home, Voronezh. I'm still yours, though you drop me, you black joke, Voronezh. You cannot stop me singing, even under your crow black dome. I'm not sure what kind or level of fidelity is being attained here, but the poem is certainly being unpacked and reconstructed into English in a fairly thoroughgoing way. I'm not even sure whether it qualifies as a translation or whether it is closer to a lower-like imitation or an adaptation, a version, a free translation, a dialogue, or simply a set of improvisations on a theme. I don't know where its natural home is. Is it a magazine of experimental literature, a textbook, a laboratory, a book of translations, or a book of poetry? It is, like the song, seeking to be true to something as intimate as the word darling, in its fashion. Producing it was an act of release.